His son stood up in that courtroom and pointed at me like I was a criminal. She manipulated a dying old man. She is nothing but a gold digger in scrubs. The lawyer beside him nodded and straightened his tie, like he had heard this kind of accusation 1,000 times and knew exactly how to sell it. The judge looked at me. I was sitting alone at the table with my hands folded, wearing the same cardigan I had worn to Mr. Alderman's funeral 2 weeks earlier. I had no lawyer. I had no family in the gallery. I had nothing except a dead man's last wish and a room full of people who wanted to take it from me. Let me go back, because you need to understand who Harold Alderman was before you can understand what happened in that courtroom. I am a nurse. My name is Grace. I have been a nurse for 22 years, not the kind who works in a gleaming hospital with new equipment and a decent parking garage. I work in home care. I go to people's houses. I help them eat. I help them bathe. I change their bandages and their sheets, and sometimes their diapers. I hold their hands when nobody else will. It is not glamorous work. Most people do not even think of it as real nursing, but it is the most human thing I have ever done. I was 46 when I got assigned to Harold Alderman. He was 83, recently widowed, living alone in a large colonial house on Birch Lane that was worth about $2.8 million. His wife Evelyn had passed 6 months before from a stroke. After she died, Harold declined fast. Not physically at first, mentally, emotionally. The man just gave up on the world. His doctor ordered home care. That is how I ended up on his doorstep one Tuesday morning in October, with a bag full of medical supplies and a clipboard full of intake forms. He answered the door in a bathrobe. He had not shaved in days. The house was immaculate, but the man inside it was falling apart. "Are you the nurse?" he asked. "Yes, sir. My name is Grace." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Well, Grace, you might as well come in. Nobody else does." That sentence broke my heart, and it turned out to be completely true. Harold had 3 children. 2 sons, Richard and James, and a daughter named Catherine. Richard was a real estate developer in the city. James was a financial advisor. Catherine lived in California and worked in tech. On paper, they were successful, respectable people. In reality, they had not visited their father in over 6 years. 6 years. Not once. Not for Evelyn's funeral. Not for Harold's 83rd birthday. Not for Christmas. Not for anything. Harold told me about it slowly, over many weeks. He was not bitter. At least not in the beginning. He made excuses for them. They were busy. They had their own families. They lived far away. He said it like he was reading from a script he had memorized so he would not have to feel the truth underneath it. But the truth was this: his children did not care. They had taken what they needed from him: college tuition, wedding money, down payments on their first homes, and then they vanished. They called on holidays, but even those calls had dried up over the past couple of years. Harold was alone, completely alone. Except for me. I came 5 days a week. I checked his vitals. I made sure he took his medications. I cooked his lunch most days because he had stopped eating properly. I drove him to doctor's appointments and waited in the lobby, reading old magazines while he saw his cardiologist. But the real work, the work that does not show up on any chart or billing code, was just being there, sitting with him, listening. Harold loved to talk about Evelyn, about the trips they took, about the garden she planted that he still watered every morning, even though half the flowers were dead, about the way she laughed, which he said sounded like wind chimes in a storm. He talked about her like she was still in the next room. He also talked about his kids, not with anger, with sadness. The kind of sadness that sits so deep it has its own gravity. "I keep thinking they will call," he said one afternoon. "I wake up every morning and check the phone. Every morning. For 6 years. I did not know what to say to that, so I just sat with him. Sometimes that is all you can do." Over 3 years, Harold and I built something that I can only describe as a quiet kind of family. He was not my patient in the clinical sense anymore. He was Harold. I knew how he took his coffee. I knew which chair was Evelyn's and why he never sat in it. I knew that he listened to Frank Sinatra on vinyl every Sunday evening, because that is what he and Evelyn used to do after dinner. He knew things about me too. He knew about my divorce. He knew about my daughter, Lily, who was in college studying to be a teacher. He knew I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on for 3 years. He laughed every time I told him about it. "Grace, let me buy you a car," he said once. "Harold, you are not buying me a car." "Why not? What else am I going to do with the money? Leave it to people who do not visit?" I thought he was joking. He was not. About 8 months before he died, Harold called a lawyer. Not the family lawyer his children would have expected. A different one. An independent estate attorney named Robert Calloway, who specialized in elder law. Harold revised his will. I did not know this at the time. He never told me. Harold passed on a Saturday morning in March. I was with him. I had stayed the night because his breathing had been bad all week and I did not want him to be alone. He went quietly. in his own bed, in his own house, with the window open and the sound of birds coming through. I was holding his hand, his eyes were closed, and his face was peaceful, and the last thing he said to me was, "Tell Evie I am coming." I sat there for a long time after. I did not call anyone right away. I just sat there and held his hand and cried. There were days when Harold barely spoke. He would sit in Evelyn's chair, the one I told you he never used, and stare out the window at the garden. On those days, I did not push him to talk. I just sat nearby and read or folded laundry or organized his pill case. Sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes it is full of things people cannot say out loud. One afternoon, about a year into my time with him, he handed me a photo album. It was leather-bound, heavy, with gold lettering on the front that said, "Our Life." He opened it to the first page. It was a picture of him and Evelyn on their wedding day. She was laughing. He was looking at her like she was the only person on earth. "We were married for 57 years, he said, "and I never once got tired of looking at her." He turned the pages slowly. Their first apartment, their kids as babies, birthday parties, vacations, Christmases. He narrated every photo like a tour guide in a museum. When he got to the last few pages, the photos were just of Evelyn in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, holding tomatoes, smiling at the camera. "She planted those the spring before she got sick," he said. "I water them every morning because I promised her I would." After that day, I watered the garden with him every morning. It became our routine. He would hold the hose and I would deadhead the flowers, and we would stand there in the early sunlight, not saying much at all. It was the most peaceful part of my day. Harold also had a routine with the phone. Every morning at exactly 8:15, he would pick up the cordless phone from the kitchen counter, check the screen for missed calls, and then set it back down. He did this so automatically that I did not even notice it for the first few months. When I finally asked him about it, he just said, "Old habit." But it was not an old habit. It was a fresh wound that he reopened every single day. I found out later, from Calloway, that Harold had written letters to all 3 of his children over the years. Dozens of them. Birthday cards, holiday letters, handwritten notes asking them to visit. He sent them by mail because Richard had blocked his phone number after an argument about money, and the others had simply stopped picking up. He kept copies of every letter in a folder in his desk. 43 letters over 6 years. Not one response. When I saw that folder, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Harold's decision about the house was not a punishment. It was not revenge. It was a statement. The simplest, most honest statement a person can make at the end of their life. You were here. They were not. The morning of the final hearing, I drove to the courthouse with the folder of Harold's letters in my bag. Calloway had not asked me to bring them. I brought them for myself. I needed to remember why I was sitting in that chair. I needed to remember whose voice I was carrying. The courtroom was cold. There's something about courtrooms that always feels cold, even when the heat is on. Maybe it is the high ceilings, maybe it is the marble, or maybe it is just the weight of what happens inside them. Richard was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. James was sitting beside him, fidgeting with his watch. Catherine was in the back row with sunglasses pushed up on her head, like she had somewhere better to be. When Calloway played the video, and Harold's face appeared on that screen, I watched the children instead of the recording. I already knew what Harold said. I wanted to see if they heard it. Richard did not move. His face was a wall, but his hands gave him away. He was gripping the armrest of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. James looked at the floor. He kept his head down for the entire video. When Harold said the part about checking the phone every morning, James brought his hand up and pressed it against his eyes. Catherine was the one who broke. When Harold said, "You never came," Grace did. She let out a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a breath. It was something in between, something that had been stuck for a long time. After the video ended and the silence settled, I realized something. That video was not just evidence in a legal case. It was Harold's way of finally being heard by his children. He could not make them listen while he was alive, so he found a way to make them listen after he was gone. 2 weeks later, I was at the reading of the will. I had not expected to be there. Robert Calloway called me and said Harold had requested my presence. I assumed he had left me something small, maybe a piece of Evelyn's jewelry or one of his vinyl records, something sentimental. When Calloway read the will, the room went silent. Harold had left the house on Birch Lane, valued at $2.8 million, to me, to Grace Abigail Monroe, his nurse. Richard, James, and Catherine received equal shares of Harold's financial accounts, which totaled about $400,000, a significant amount, but nothing compared to the house. Harold had also left a letter explaining his decision, but Calloway said the letter would be entered into the record only if the will was contested. It took exactly 72 hours. Richard filed a lawsuit. He claimed I had exerted undue influence over a vulnerable elderly man. He said I had manipulated Harold into changing his will. He called me a predator. He hired a law firm called Whitfield and Associates, one of the most expensive litigation firms in the state. James and Catherine joined the suit. I could not afford a lawyer. I had $14,000 in my savings account. I called 6 attorneys. 3 would not take the case. 2 wanted retainers I could not pay. The 6th said, "Ma'am, this is a fight you cannot win. Settle." I did not want to settle. Harold wanted me to have that house. He made that decision with a clear mind and a full heart, and I was not going to let his children, the same children who did not visit him for 6 years, undo it because they were embarrassed that a nurse mattered more than they did. So I showed up to court alone. No lawyer, no legal training, just a woman in a cardigan with a folder of documents she did not fully understand. The first hearing was brutal. Richard's attorney, a man named Philip Tate, was polished and aggressive. He painted a picture of me as a scheming caregiver who had isolated Harold from his family, turned him against his children, and manipulated him into rewriting his will. He used words like vulnerable, cognitive decline, financial exploitation, and elder abuse. None of it was true, but in a courtroom, when one side has a team of lawyers and the other side has a cardigan, the truth has to fight harder. The judge asked me if I had representation. I said no. He asked if I understood the seriousness of the allegations. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to request a continuance to find an attorney. I said, "Your Honor, I do not have the money for an attorney, but I am not going to let anyone rewrite this man's last wishes because it is convenient for them." The judge looked at me for a long moment. Then he scheduled the next hearing for 30 days later. I went home that night and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment and cried until I ran out of tears. Then I went inside and started reading everything I could find about probate law. 3 days before the next hearing, I got a phone call. It was Robert Calloway, Harold's attorney. He said he needed to meet with me urgently. I drove to his office the next morning. He was sitting behind his desk with a small digital camera and a USB drive. Harold made this 8 months before he passed, he said. He instructed me to present it only if the will was contested. He turned his laptop toward me and pressed play. Harold was sitting in his armchair, the one next to Evelyn's. He was wearing a blue sweater I recognized. He looked thin, but his eyes were sharp, clear, completely lucid. He spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Harold Alderman. I am 83 years old. I am of sound mind, and I'm making this recording of my own free will, without coercion, and without anyone else present except my attorney, Robert Calloway." He paused. "If you are watching this, it means my children have contested my will. I expected that. I want to explain why I made the decisions I made." He took a breath. "My children have not visited me in 6 years. Not once. Not for their mother's funeral. Not for my birthday. Not for Christmas. I waited for them. Every day I waited. I checked the phone every morning. I looked out the window every afternoon. Nobody came." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "Grace came. Grace came every day. She cooked for me. She drove me to the doctor. She sat with me when I talked about Evelyn, even when I told the same stories, over and over again. She held my hand when I was afraid. She treated me like a human being when my own children treated me like an inconvenience." He looked directly into the camera. "I am leaving my house to Grace because she earned it. Not with manipulation, not with schemes, with kindness, with presence, with 3 years of showing up when nobody else would." He paused again. "To my children, if you are watching this, I want you to know that I loved you. I always loved you. But love is not a bank account you can ignore for years and then withdraw from when it suits you. I waited for you. You never came. Grace did." The video ended. I was sobbing. Calloway handed me a tissue and said, "I will be presenting this at the hearing. You are not going to need a lawyer, Grace. Harold already made the case." The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Richard, James, and Catherine were all there. Tate was there, with his briefcase and his confidence. The gallery was full of people I did not know, probably friends of the family, maybe reporters. I sat alone at my table, but this time I was not afraid. Tate went first. He repeated the same arguments: undue influence, cognitive decline, a vulnerable man taken advantage of by a caregiver with access and opportunity. He spoke for 20 minutes. He was convincing. He was theatrical. He was everything a good lawyer is supposed to be. Then Calloway stood up. He introduced himself as the attorney who had drafted Harold's revised will. He stated that Harold had been evaluated by an independent physician 2 weeks before signing the new will and was found to be mentally competent. Then he said, "Your Honor, my client anticipated that his children would contest this will." He prepared a statement. "With the court's permission, I would like to present it." The judge nodded. Calloway connected the USB drive to the courtroom's display system. Harold's face appeared on the screen. 83 years old, blue sweater, sharp eyes. The courtroom went completely still. Harold spoke, every word I already described to you, about the 6 years of silence, about the phone he checked every morning, about grace, about kindness, about showing up. When he said, "My children treated me like an inconvenience," Catherine started crying. James looked at the floor. Richard stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, like he was trying to hold something inside that was about to break. When the video ended, nobody moved. The judge took off his glasses and set them on the bench. Tate stood up slowly. "Your Honor, we would like to request a recess." The judge looked at him. "Denied. I have seen enough." He turned to face both sides. "In 28 years on this bench, I have presided over hundreds of estate disputes. Most of them are about money. Some of them are about pride. Very few of them are about love." He paused. "This one is about love." He ruled in my favor. The will stood. The house was mine. After the ruling, I walked out of the courtroom alone. Catherine was standing in the hallway. She looked at me and said, "Did he really check the phone every morning?" "Every single morning," I said. She did not say anything else. She just stood there, and I could see it breaking her in real time. Not anger, not resentment, regret. The kind of regret that has no fix. I still live in Harold's house. Evelyn's garden is blooming again. I water it every morning, just like he taught me. I kept his armchair in the living room, and Evelyn's chair beside it. I play Frank Sinatra on vinyl every Sunday evening. My daughter Lily moved in with me after she graduated. She teaches 2nd grade now. She uses the upstairs bedroom that used to be Catherine's. I wonder sometimes if Harold would have liked that. I think he would. I think about him every day. Not about the house, not about the money, about the way he looked at me that first morning on his doorstep and said, "You might as well come in. Nobody else does." If you are listening to this and there is someone in your life, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, who is waiting for a phone call that never comes, please make that call. You do not have to stay long. You do not have to say anything profound. Just show up. That is all Harold ever wanted, and it is the one thing his children never gave him. You cannot inherit love. You have to earn it, and you earn it by being there. The judge looked at my husband's lawyer and said, "Counselor, please present the prenuptial agreement." The lawyer smiled. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a 47-page document, and placed it on the table like he was laying down a winning hand in poker. My husband leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked at me the way he always did when he thought he had won. That particular smile, the one that said, "I told you, you will leave with nothing." But he had made one mistake. He never actually read the whole thing. My name is Sandra. I was married to a man named Victor Hale for 15 years. When we met, he was running a struggling furniture import business out of a rented warehouse. By the time I filed for divorce, that business was worth $38 million, and every single person in his life gave him the credit. Every award, every magazine profile, every speech at every industry dinner. Victor Hale, the self-made man. Nobody ever mentioned me, but I am the reason that company exists. When we got engaged, Victor insisted on a prenuptial agreement. He said it was standard. He said his lawyer recommended it. He said it had nothing to do with trust. I was 26. I was in love. I signed it. I barely read it. I trusted him, and I thought trust meant not asking too many questions. The agreement was straightforward. If we divorced, all business assets remained with Victor. I would receive a fixed settlement of $200,000, regardless of the length of the marriage or my contributions to the business. No equity, no profit sharing, no claim to the company. There was one clause on page 31 that Victor had insisted on including himself. He told his lawyer to add it because he wanted to show me how committed he was. It was a fidelity clause. If either party was found to have engaged in extramarital affairs during the marriage, the faithful spouse would be entitled to 60% of all marital and business assets, and the unfaithful party would forfeit the fixed settlement protections entirely. Victor added that clause because he wanted to look loyal. He wanted to impress me. He never in a million years thought it would apply to him. For the first 5 years, things were good. I worked alongside Victor every day. I did not have a title. I did not have a salary. I was just the wife, but I was the one who redesigned the product catalog. I was the one who found the shipping company that cut costs by 40%. I was the one who flew to suppliers overseas and negotiated bulk pricing while Victor stayed home and played golf with investors. By year 7, the company had grown from 12 employees to over 200. Revenue went from $800,000 to $14 million. I managed the office. I hired the operations team. I built the customer service department from scratch. I opened the second and third warehouses. Victor's name was on everything. Mine was on nothing. Let me tell you about the years in between, because I think people imagine that being married to someone like Victor was all silk robes and champagne. It was not. It was 18-hour days. It was flying to trade shows while 7 months pregnant because Victor said he had a scheduling conflict.
It was negotiating with shipping companies on the phone while making dinner and helping Adrian with his math homework. There was one night, maybe year 8 or 9, when I was at the office until 11,
finishing a presentation for a client meeting. The next morning, Victor had left at 5. When I got home, he was asleep. The presentation went perfectly the next day. The client signed. It was our biggest account to date. When Victor told the story at the annual company party, he said, "I stayed up all night putting this together." People clapped. I stood in the back of the room, holding a glass of wine and said nothing. That was the pattern. I did the work. He took the bow. And for a long time I told myself that it was enough to know the truth, even if nobody else did. But it was not enough. It ate at me slowly, the way water eats at stone. Not all at once, just enough to leave a mark. When I found out about Danielle, the thing that hurt the most was not the betrayal. It was the location. Our bedroom, the one I had decorated, the sheets I had picked out, the nightstand where I kept the book I was reading. He could not even bother to go somewhere else. That is how little he respected my presence in his life. I was so invisible that he did not think twice about erasing me. In my own home, Patricia told me something during our first meeting that I will never forget. She said, "Sandra, most women in your position feel guilty about fighting for what they deserve. They have been trained to feel grateful for whatever they get. I need you to understand something. You are not taking anything from Victor. You are collecting a debt." She was right. 15 years of unpaid labor, 15 years of invisible contributions, 15 years of building a $38 million company that had my fingerprints on every wall, and my name on nothing. The day of the hearing, when Patricia read that fidelity clause out loud, I looked at Victor. He was sitting perfectly still, but I could see his jaw working. He was grinding his teeth. It is a thing he does when he is trying to control himself. I have seen him do it 1,000 times. At business dinners when a deal went sideways. At our son's school events when another parent said something he disagreed with. He grinds his teeth and smiles and pretends everything is fine. But everything was not fine, because the clause he wrote to prove his loyalty was now the instrument of his undoing, and the woman he treated like furniture was the one holding the key. Shelton tried one more thing. He argued that my evidence of the affair was obtained improperly. Patricia had anticipated this. She presented a signed affidavit from Danielle herself, who had cooperated voluntarily after learning that Victor had been seeing a third woman during the same period. Danielle was not protecting me. She was getting her own revenge. But the result was the same. The judge did not even deliberate. He ruled from the bench that afternoon. Around year 10, things started to change. Victor started working late. Then he started traveling more. Then he started locking his phone. The usual progression. I am not stupid. I knew what was happening, but I had 2 kids by then, our sons, Adrian and Thomas, and I told myself that keeping the family together was more important than confronting the truth. Then one night, I came home early from a business trip. I walked into our bedroom and found Victor with his executive assistant, a woman named Danielle, who I had hired personally 6 months earlier. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I stood in the doorway and thought about page 31. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney. Her name was Patricia Long. She was 62 years old, 5 feet tall, and the most terrifying person in every room she entered. She had handled some of the biggest divorce cases in the state. I told her everything, the prenup, the clause, Victor and Danielle. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said one thing. "Does he know you know about the clause?" "No," she smiled. "Good. Do not tell him." Victor filed first. His lawyer, a man named Grant Shelton from a firm that charged $900 an hour, served me with papers 3 days later. He was confident. He had the prenup. He had the fixed settlement. He thought this would be quick. $200,000 and goodbye. The first hearing was a formality. Shelton presented the prenuptial agreement and asked the court to enforce it as written. He summarized the terms. He emphasized that both parties had signed voluntarily. He made it sound airtight. The judge asked me if I had anything to say. Patricia stood up. "Your Honor, we do not dispute the validity of the prenuptial agreement. In fact, we would like to invoke it." Shelton looked confused. Victor shifted in his seat. Patricia opened her copy of the prenup to page 31. She read the fidelity clause out loud, word for word. every sentence that Victor had insisted on, including to prove how loyal he was. Then she submitted the evidence: photographs, hotel receipts, text messages between Victor and Danielle going back 14 months, a credit card statement showing a necklace purchased for $9,000 that I never received. Shelton asked for a recess. The judge denied it. Patricia then submitted documentation of my contributions to the business, contracts I had negotiated, emails showing I had managed day-to-day operations, testimony from 3 former employees confirming that I was the operational backbone of the company. The judge reviewed everything. He looked at Victor. "Mr. Hale, you inserted this clause into the agreement yourself?" Victor did not answer. Shelton answered for him. "Your Honor, that clause was intended as a mutual commitment. It reads as a mutual commitment," the judge said, "and the evidence before me suggests only one party broke it." He ruled in my favor. 60% of all marital and business assets, the house, primary custody. Victor kept the company name, but I walked away with $23 million, and the knowledge that the clause he wrote to impress me was the same clause that set me free. After the ruling, Victor stood in the hallway, outside the courtroom. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You knew," he said. "You knew about that clause the whole time. I knew about it before you cheated, Victor. You should have read your own contract." I walked out of that courthouse and drove to the school to pick up my boys. Adrian asked me why I was smiling. I told him because Mom finally got the credit she deserved. I started my own company 6 months later, Import Logistics, the same work I had been doing for free for 15 years. Within a year, 3 of Victor's biggest clients switched to me, not because I asked them to, because they knew who had actually been running things all along. If you are listening to this, and you are in a marriage where your work goes unnoticed, where your name is never mentioned, where someone else takes the credit for the life you built, know this: your contributions are not invisible. They are documented in every success that person enjoys. And one day, the record will be set straight. Sometimes it happens in a courtroom. Sometimes it happens when you finally decide you deserve to be seen. Do not wait for permission to claim what is yours. If someone hands you a contract, read every single page. You never know which clause might save your life. My neighbor walked into that courtroom like she owned it. Designer bag, lawyer in a $3,000 suit, a folder full of documents she probably paid someone else to prepare. She looked at me, sitting at the other table, and smiled the way people smile when they think the outcome is already decided. I was 68 years old, wearing khaki pants and a flannel shirt I had ironed that morning. I had one envelope. That is all I brought. One envelope. My name is Eugene Walsh. I have lived in the same house on Maple Drive for 41 years. I bought it in 1983 with my wife Charlotte, when we were both 27 and too young to know what we were getting into. It was a fixer-upper on a quiet street with a big yard and a crooked mailbox. We raised 3 kids there. We buried a dog in the backyard. We painted every room twice. It is not a mansion. It is a home. Charlotte passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. After she died, I thought about selling, but I could not do it. Every corner of that house has her fingerprints on it. The wallpaper she chose for the kitchen. The garden bed she dug along the back fence. The scratch on the hallway floor from when our son tried to ride his bicycle inside on a rainy day. I was not leaving. About 2 years ago, the house next door sold. The old owners, Bill and Diane Tucker, had lived there for 30 years. Good neighbors, quiet. Bill used to lend me his snowblower every winter. When they moved to a retirement community in Florida, I figured whoever bought the place would be fine. New neighbors, new chapter. I was wrong. Vivian Drake moved in. She was somewhere in her 50s, recently divorced, and she had very specific ideas about how things should look. Within 2 months, she had ripped out Bill's old flower beds, replaced the driveway, repainted the exterior, and installed a 6-foot privacy fence along 3 sides of her property. The 4th side, the side facing my house, she left open. That is where the trouble started. Vivian decided she wanted to extend her garden into the space between our houses. The problem was, that space was mine. The property line ran about 4 feet from the side of her house, meaning there was a strip of my land between her house and my fence. A narrow strip, maybe 12 feet long, that I had been mowing for 40 years. She knocked on my door one afternoon and asked if she could use that strip for her garden. I said no. I was polite about it. I told her it was my property and I had plans for it, which was not entirely true, but I did not owe her an explanation. She smiled tightly and said, "Well, we will see about that." 3 weeks later, got served. Vivian Drake was suing me. She claimed that the fence I had built in 1989 was positioned incorrectly and that it encroached on her property by approximately 4 feet. She was asking the court to order me to remove the fence and redraw the property line. Her attorney was a man named Craig Barlow. Expensive suit, expensive watch. The kind of lawyer who bills $400 an hour and spends half of it looking at his phone. He filed the complaint with a property survey conducted by a firm Vivian had hired, claiming the original boundary was wrong. I did not have a lawyer. I did not have money for one either. What I had was a box in my attic, a box Charlotte had kept. She was the organized one. She saved everything: receipts, tax returns, appliance manuals, and as it turned out, every document related to the house. The night I got served, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight and started looking. It took me 2 hours, but I found it. A manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, with Charlotte's handwriting on the front that said, "Property, keep." Inside was the original survey from 1957, not the one from when we bought the house, the one from when the lots were first subdivided. It had been conducted by a licensed surveyor named Gerald Oakes, and it had been commissioned by the original developer of the neighborhood, a man named Donald Drake, Vivian's father-in-law, the man who built both houses. I opened the survey and laid it on the kitchen table. I am not a lawyer, but I can read a map, and what that map showed was something Vivian probably did not want anyone to see. The original boundary line was not where her survey said it was. It was 4 feet in the other direction, meaning it was not my fence that was on her property. It was her house that was on mine. 4 feet of her foundation sat on my land. It had been that way since 1957. 66 years. I had never said anything about it. I had never even known about it until that night. Bill and Diane never mentioned it either. For 40 years, we had just been good neighbors who did not measure things. I put the survey back in the envelope and went to bed. The hearing was in 3 weeks. When the day came, I arrived early. Vivian was already there, sitting behind her lawyer, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. Barlow was arranging his documents. They had binders. They had printed surveys. They had a presentation prepared on a laptop. I sat at my table with my one envelope. The judge called the case. Barlow went first. He presented Vivian's survey, explained the alleged encroachment, and asked the court to order me to remove my fence and cede the disputed strip. He spoke for about 15 minutes. He was smooth, professional, convincing if you did not know the full story. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Walsh, do you have a response?" I stood up. My knees cracked. I could feel Vivian looking at me. "Your Honor, I do. But first I would like to submit a document into evidence." I opened the envelope and pulled out the 1957 survey. I walked it up to the bench. The judge took it, put on his reading glasses, and studied it. "Mr. Walsh, where did you obtain this?" "My late wife kept it in a box in our attic, Your Honor. It is the original survey from when these lots were first subdivided, conducted by a licensed surveyor and commissioned by the original developer." "And the original developer's name?" "Donald Drake, Your Honor." The judge looked at Vivian. She had stopped scrolling. "The same Drake as the plaintiff?" "Her former father-in-law, Your Honor." The judge spent several minutes comparing the two surveys. Then he asked Barlow to approach the bench. They spoke quietly. I could not hear what was said, but I watched Barlow's posture change. His shoulders dropped. He stopped nodding. The judge addressed the courtroom. Based on the original survey submitted by the defendant, it appears that the plaintiff's property, specifically approximately 4 feet of the eastern foundation, sits on land belonging to the defendant. This survey predates the plaintiff's survey by 66 years, and then was commissioned by the original developer of both properties. He paused. "Ms. Drake, your complaint alleges that the defendant's fence encroaches on your property. However, the evidence before me suggests the opposite. It is your structure that encroaches on his." Vivian stood up. "That is not possible. I had a professional survey done, and the defendant has an older one, commissioned by your family." The courtroom was quiet. The judge looked at Vivian. "Ms. Drake, would you like to proceed with this case? Because if you do, the defendant may have grounds for a counterclaim regarding the encroachment of your foundation on his land, a claim he has apparently chosen not to pursue for the 41 years he has lived there." Vivian looked at Barlow. Barlow shook his head slightly. "We withdraw the complaint, Your Honor." Case dismissed. I walked out of that courthouse with the same envelope I walked in with. Vivian was standing by her car in the parking lot. She did not look at me. Barlow was talking to her, probably explaining how much that mistake just cost. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and sat on the porch for a while. Charlotte would have loved this. She would have laughed for a week. She was the one who saved that envelope. She was the one who wrote "keep" on the front in her careful handwriting, probably 30 years ago, probably thinking it would never matter. It mattered. There is something I did not mention about Charlotte and that envelope. She was a school teacher, 4th grade, for 32 years. She was not a lawyer. She was not an accountant. She was a woman who believed that keeping records was how regular people protected themselves against a world that does not always play fair. She kept everything. Tax, returns going back to the 80s, warranties for appliances we had not owned in 20 years, receipts for home repairs, and for what and apparently a survey from 1957 that she must have found in the pile of documents when we bought the house. I never even looked at those papers. I signed where they told me to sign and went back to worrying about the leaky roof. Charlotte read everything. She filed everything, and she wrote keep on the things that mattered. When I was sitting in that courtroom, holding that envelope, I thought about her. I thought about the thousands of small decisions she made over the course of our life together that I never noticed and never thanked her for. The filing, the organizing, the careful, quiet maintenance of a life. She kept our world in order, and I took it for granted until she was gone and the order started to slip. That envelope was Charlotte's hand, reaching out from wherever she is now and saying, "I told you to keep this for a reason." After the case was dismissed, I drove home and went straight to the attic. I opened Charlotte's box and looked through everything she had saved, every envelope, every folder. I did not throw any of it away. I just sat there among her careful labels and her neat handwriting and said, "Thank you, Charlie." I think about that every day now, how the people who save us are not always the ones standing in the room. Sometimes they are the ones who were there 30 years ago, writing a single word on the front of an envelope, trusting that someday it would matter. The next morning, Vivian's landscaper showed up and started working on her side of the property, nowhere near my fence. I waved at him from the yard. He waved back. Vivian and I do not speak. That is fine. I do not need to be friends with everyone. But I do think she learned something that day. Just because you have more money, a better lawyer, and a louder voice does not mean you are right. Sometimes the truth is sitting in a box, in an attic, in an envelope marked "Keep," waiting for the day someone finally needs it. Charlotte knew. Charlotte always knew. If you are listening to this, let me tell you something. Keep your documents. Keep your receipts. Keep the boring stuff that sits in boxes and collects dust. Because one day, when someone with a $3,000 lawyer tries to take what is yours, that dusty envelope might be the only thing standing between you and losing everything. And if someone you love keeps a box of papers you think is pointless, do not throw it away. Trust me on that one.